Namo Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya. Om. Salutations to Bhagavan Ramakrishna. On behalf of the Vedanta Society, I'm happy to present Raka Banerjee, who is going to speak on the principles and practices of Zen Buddhism. Zen. And to bring us into context, Raka means full moon. Full moon, the moon in its full splendor. And the birth of Buddha, the great teacher, happened to be the thrice blessed day. He was born on the full moon. He attained nirvana when it was full moon. And he also discarded his body when it was full moon. So, you see the connections? Buddha's birthday will be on the 23rd of May. Today, however, is Mother's Day. It's a very happy day, as well as a very auspicious day. It's the birthday of Shankaracharya also. So, Raka, I don't know. She calls us monkles. Monk, uncle. So, she practically grew up here at the center. And she has been practicing Zen Buddhism since 2016. And is a graduate of the Buddhist chaplaincy training program at Upaya Zen Center. She was ordained a priest by Sensei Joshin Byronus, okay, in 2021, and is currently studying with Sensei Jensen Quennell. Yeah, so Zen, it's a very long, you can say, tradition in Buddhism, ancient tradition, but we have Zen Buddhism that has spread all over Asia. So in China, from where it actually started, in the Tang dynasty, it was as Chan Buddhism. And then we have in Korean, Seon, in Vietnamese, Thien. So this is a school of Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana is the great vehicle. So contrasted to the lesser vehicle in the southern school called Hinayana, the smaller vehicle. It relies on not so much on doctrines, Zen Buddhism, but on direct insight, the meditative practices. So it has come, the words Chan and Zen and all these things have come from the root word Dhyan. That is meditation. So here you see the entire processes of meditation adapted to various climes and times, giving up new philosophies. So Buddhism had that flexibility. Like most religions, Buddhism does not depend on just the Buddha, the founder. It depends on the basic structure and psychology of the human body and mind. And that's the reason why they say you have to enter into something called the Buddha mind through Zazen. Directly you kind of enter into it. So whether you call it Zazen or you want to attain something called a Satori, that intuitive, you can say, insight into things, it ends with freedom. That's the goal of Buddhism. Now in Vedanta we will call it Brahma Nirvana, the extinguishing of oneself into Brahman. And the Buddhists say nirvana. It's the same thing. I mean, there are philosophical differences. And so we're going to have Raka speak on some of these principles and practices of Zen Buddhism. She also has been initiated into the non-dualistic traditions of Vedanta by Swami Sridharananda, who is currently the Vedanta monk in Australia. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah.
I'll start with a chant, one of our prayers that we do. Buddham saranam gacchami, dhammam saranam gacchami, sangham saranam gacchami, dutiyampi buddham saranam gacchami, dutiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami, dutiyampi sangham saranam gacchami, tatyampi buddham saranam gacchami, tatyampi dhammam saranam gacchami, tatyampi sangham saranam gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you all today. As Maharaj said, I've literally grown up here at this Vedanta Center, so I'm honored to be able to share something of my spiritual practice with you today, which is a blend of Zen and Vedanta. So Maharaj asked me to speak about the principles and practices of Zen, which is, of course, a very small topic. So while it's impossible to cover the whole of Zen in 45 minutes, I will do my best to share some of what I've learned in these past several years. So what do you think when you hear the word Zen? Usually when we hear Zen in popular culture, we think of some really relaxed, chilled out, sort of blissful state, you know, oh, I felt so Zen. When I searched for Zen on Google Maps, I found a couple actual Zen centers, but then I also found Zen Attitude Acupuncture, Zen Dental Center, Zen TechWorks, Zen Bookkeeping Services, Zen Dog Walking, Sushi Zen, Zen Ramen and Sushi Burrito, and even Aquarium Zen, a tropical fish store, all within the Seattle area. So the list goes on. Obviously, all sorts of businesses want to make their customers think about the calm, relaxing, blissful aura of Zen. But the funny thing is, practicing Zen Buddhism is actually mostly quite unpleasant. I mean, obviously not all the time, or no one would do it, but I do remember that my first Zen teacher became quite concerned when he learned that I was having such a nice time early on during my meditations. I was feeling like I was resting in some vast and meaningful sense of peace and joy, and he started to get nervous that I was doing it wrong. He kept checking, like, are you sure you're really doing Zen? You seem so happy. I'm joking around, but the thing is, Zen is actually a very rigorous and austere form of religious practice. We wear all black so as not to trouble the mind with any distracting colors. Zen meditation halls, which are called zendos, are so utterly silent that you can literally hear someone breathing all the way on the other side of the hall. Once you take your seated position, you're instructed not to move, not to readjust your position, not to straighten a leg that started to cramp, certainly not to scratch your nose or to wipe away the sweat that's trickling down into your eye. You don't move until the bell rings. When you bow, the hands are folded just so, elbows up. When you sit, your legs are folded just so, and your hands are held just so. The left hand is cradled in the right in a position known as the cosmic mudra. The eyes are kept half open, angled downward, and with a soft gaze. Open but unfocused, not looking at anything in particular. All these ritual movements in Zen have their logistical and symbolic components. So holding our hands in this cosmic mudra, it symbolically represents that we are holding the entire cosmos within the rounded shape of our hands, a shape that is simultaneously full and empty. And it also serves a logistical purpose. It helps us to gauge our degree of concentration. Sometimes you're sitting and you might notice that your thumbs start to sag down, and then you realize, oh, I'm not really paying attention. Or you might notice that you're really pushing those thumbs together, and you realize that your mind has become fixated on some really terrible thing that someone said to you at work yesterday. So it has symbolic meaning, and it also helps us to keep our mind on the practice. And it's the same with the eyes. We keep them open symbolically because we're still a part of the world. We're not shutting it out. And at the same time, symbolically, we're remaining unattached to what we're seeing because we're not intensely looking at something. We're just remaining open to the world with our soft gaze. And logistically, keeping the eyes open tends to help keep people from falling asleep. So there's that. The title of this talk is The Principles and Practices of Zen Buddhism, and I want to start with the practices because that is really the whole thing. And instead of practices, I should just say practice, because Zen Buddhism really just has one practice, which is zazen, sitting meditation, as Maharaj said. Zen begins and ends with zazen. It's the beginning, middle, and end of Zen practice. And this makes a lot of sense if you know the etymology of the word Zen. As Maharaj mentioned, it came from, in China, what was Chan, and in Sanskrit, dhyana, meditation, concentration, sustained attention of the mind. It's no surprise then that the practice of Zen involves mostly sitting, sometimes standing, sometimes walking slowly, but sitting and attending to the mind, allowing the nature of the mind to reveal itself, and in that process, for what lies beyond the mind to be revealed. Dogen Zenji, who is the father of the lineage of Zen in which I practice, which is known as Soto Zen, is known for writing some of the most beautiful, opaque, and beautifully opaque texts about the practice of Zen. In his essay called Genjo Koan, which can be translated as actualizing the fundamental point, he says, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things." I'll say it again. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. This can be understood to be one of the most fundamental principles of Zen, emptiness. People often hear emptiness and think that it sounds kind of depressing, right? Empty has sort of a negative connotation in English. It's better, as most things are in Sanskrit, shunyata, which means that all things of this world are empty of any essence. There is nothing to this being that I call Raka beyond conceptual constructs. Where is Raka? Is it this body, this pillowcase, as Sri Ramakrishna calls it? Or as we say in Zen, who is it that drags this corpse around? Is Raka these words that I'm saying? Is it the thoughts in my head? the baby that I was decades ago, when you try to point to anything, you'll see that you can't actually draw a boundary to say, yes, this is Raka. And so to come back to that quote, when we study the self, the little self, the personality, the person that we all believe ourselves to be, when we study that self, we see that there is nothing there that we can point to or hold on to. And in fact, the idea of that little self itself disappears. We forget the self. And when we forget the self, as Dogen puts it, we are actualized by the 10,000 things. What does that mean? We see that we are not separate from all that is, that there is in fact no me in here and no you out there. There is only one non-dual and indivisible reality. If everything is empty of an independent self, then in fact everything is inseparable and whole and inherently full. Shunyam is purnam. Emptiness is fullness. Okay, that's a lot to take in, I realize. And you might be thinking, okay, cool, that all sounds great. But how do we experience that? How do we live that reality? Well, in Zen, we practice sitting meditation, or zazen. We enter quietly into the meditation hall, which we call the zendo. We bow to the Buddha. We bow to our seat and to the person sitting across from us. And then we take the posture of the Buddha and we sit silently and observe just what is happening in our minds. So what happens in our minds? Imagine if the contents of your mind could be written out in essay form, just like a 10-minute snippet of your mind. There might be some rumblings from the body, like I'm hungry or my stomach hurts. There might be some reviewing of some recent events, like I can't believe that guy cut me off on I-5. How did he even get a license driving like that, et cetera, et cetera. There might be some planning. After that bell rings and I can get out of here, I'm going to get some groceries, and I have to email so-and-so about that work thing, and then maybe I'll watch a nice movie tonight, et cetera, et cetera. And there might even be some self-reflection if we're lucky. Oh shoot, I got distracted again. I'm supposed to be meditating. And then come the self-recriminations. I always do this. Why can't I stay focused? What's wrong with me? Et cetera, et cetera. And this is all perfectly normal. After all, this is the nature of the mind, the monkey mind, as we call it. There's a saying that the mind makes a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. And given the constant jumping about of our monkey minds, this practice of zazen, of fixing the mind on an object, be it the breath, be it the posture, or any other anchor, and letting everything else rest. This practice is a practice of constantly coming back, gently bringing the mind back to the present moment over and over and over. And as we do that, hundreds and eventually thousands of times, several things start to happen. One is that we become more aware of what exactly goes on in these monkey minds of ours. Rather than letting our minds run the show, we learn how to sit back and observe, and we start to see our habits of mind. And this is another reason that I said that Zen is mostly quite unpleasant. You might be that one lucky person who has a mind that is only filled with flowers and puppies and the milk of human kindness. But most of us, when we slow down long enough to look at what's going on in there, we're going to see things that we don't like. I remember on my second or third 5-day silent retreat, which in Zen we call a sesshin, I remember that I was getting really frustrated with all of the mistakes that everyone was making. People were doing the walking meditation way too slowly. Yes, we move slowly during walking meditation, but come on, people, you're not just supposed to stand there. And the meditation bell was being rung way too loudly, and the chant leader was chanting in the wrong key. So finally, after muttering to myself in my head for a few days angrily, it occurred to me to ask myself, wait, why do I think that the walking is too slow? Well, or why do I think that that's the wrong key for the chant? I responded very logically to myself, well, because I don't like it like that. Aha! So the correct pace of walking, or the correct key for the chant, is the way that I like it. I see. Little insights like this might sound kind of silly, but it hit me like a revelation. Oh, the world is just the way that it is, regardless of whether I like it. And ultimately, it is not for me to judge how it's supposed to be. Oh, I can certainly prefer for things to be one way instead of another. But as Zen Master Dogen writes, flowers fall, though we love them. Weeds grow, though we despise them. There is so much wisdom in accepting the world just as it is, recognizing that we do not own it, we cannot control it, and it is not even for us to judge it. We are given this precious human birth to see this world for what it truly is, something far beyond what any of us can grasp. So that's one thing that happens when we start to observe our minds. We start to see how our thoughts work, and we start to question the habitual patterns of our minds. And through that observation, insights arise, insights that help us to understand the nature of the world and our place in it. What else happens when we practice Zazen, when we sit Zazen? Zen practice is truly practice. We are practicing in the cushion how to be in the world. Sitting quietly in a dark hall, unmoving, facing a wall, you might think that there's not much going on. It might even seem boring. But soon you realize that you brought the entire world with you. All sorts of things can come up when you're sitting quietly. Moments from your childhood, feelings of anger or joy, discomfort of the body, torpor of the mind. And with each thing that presents itself to you, you simply observe it with kind attention. You take the position of the witness, the eternal observer, that big self that's not the little self that you think you are, and you watch what happens. And crucially, you don't respond. That's the difference. Because in the world, we always respond, don't we? Your nose itches, you'll scratch it. You're feeling cold, you put on a sweater. You're hungry, you go to the kitchen and get something to eat. But when we're practicing Zazen, sitting in the Zendo, we don't do any of that. Your nose itches, you sit. You're feeling cold, you sit. You're hungry, you sit. You remember you need to urgently reply to that text message, you sit. Simply sitting still and watching the restless movements of the mind can teach you so much. You can learn what you tend to focus on. Do you worry about the future or reminisce about the past? Do you tend to eagerly anticipate the things you like or anxiously avoid the things you dislike? Does your mind tend to go to your relationships or does it focus more on your tasks and chores? Do you remember the wounds of the past or do you plot out conversations in your head about how you'll handle things in the future? All of that is interesting and can reveal our blind spots to ourselves, if we can be self-reflective and simply observe the thoughts rather than letting them run the show. But what's even more important than the content is to notice that you really can not react. You can meet whatever is arising in your mind with equanimity. Although your body and mind may both clamor for your attention, urgently making their case, you can choose to remain still. This is a superpower in a world where we're constantly being urged to buy this, go here, do that, try this. There is a superpower in the ability to just remain still. As Sri Ramana Maharshi put it, with your hands at work in the world, your head can remain cool in solitude. Learning that we can choose not to react, not to respond, this gives us a taste of true freedom. This is what Sri Krishna describes in the Bhagavad Gita, one who is alike to friend and foe, in honor and in dishonor, and also alike in cold and heat, in joy and sorrow, without attachment. Because yes, this is the practice of Zazen. It is the practice of non-attachment. Sitting for hours, despite the complaints of your mind and the discomfort of your body, you learn in your very bones that you really can exist in this world without movement, without reaction, without attachment. And this is the great secret of Zazen, which no one tells you, because in Zen, no one tells you anything. But I'll tell you the secret. And it's that if you can learn how to sit unmoving for hours, you discover that you're not some creature at the whims of your body and your mind. You discover that you are not your body. And what's more, you are not your mind either. You are not your thoughts, because you can observe your thoughts and you can see that they come and go in the light of your awareness. And once you are not driven constantly by the desires of your body and mind, once you've learned to tame them through the repeated practice of just sitting quietly, something miraculous can happen. And I don't know how this happens or what makes it happen or why it happens to some people and not others. This is the mystery of spiritual practice. But when the clamor of the body and the mind die down, and you're not being run ragged by their demands, and you're just sitting there in the dark zendo quietly, you might suddenly notice nothing is missing. Nothing is missing. Can you see how radical that is? Like, can you look at your life moment by moment and notice how there's almost constantly something missing? Oh, this lecture is okay, but I'm getting a little bored. Or, I'm glad it's sunny today, but it's a little hotter than I'd like. Or, oh, today is going well, but I wish I didn't have to wake up early for work tomorrow. Even when we're not actively aware of that nagging sense of lack, this is the nature of life. There's always something missing somewhere. This is really what the Buddha was talking about in what's called the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha. Often it gets translated to something like, life is suffering. But suffering isn't really a good translation of dukkha. The best translation I've heard of it, actually, to date, comes from Lee Brasington, a meditation teacher, and he calls it a bummer. Because it's really more about the inherent unsatisfactory nature of life. It's a bummer. And that's not to say that it's unsatisfactory all of the time, by all means. But the very pleasure of a thing already contains the unsatisfactoriness within it. The ice cream is delicious while it lasts, but then it's gone, isn't it? Nothing lasts, nothing is permanent. We can't ever get totally comfortable and then just stay that way. This is how we get to what the Buddha called the three marks of existence: dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Dukkha is that bummer, that dissatisfaction that you just can't get totally comfortable. Anicca is impermanence. Everything is always changing. And anatta is what I was talking about earlier, about emptiness, that nothing in the world has a fixed essence. You can't pin down any part of me and call it Raka, because on some level, Raka doesn't really exist. When you really think about it, you'll see that your life is characterized by these three marks of existence. You can't get comfortable because everything is always changing and nothing is permanent or fixed. And that's why people often turn to all sorts of things to try to get through this hamster wheel feeling of life that we get sometimes. People try to avoid this unpleasant feeling of lack, or what some might call existential dread. And we can drown it out momentarily through alcohol or drugs, for sure, but even through other milder ways of hiding the nature of the world from ourselves, like Netflix, or books, or crossword puzzles, or anything that can let us forget for a little while that we're living on this hamster wheel of constantly trying to feel good and trying not to feel bad. It's so exhausting, isn't it? And so getting back to that secret of Zazen. Again, this is the miracle that no one in Zen tells you, because Zen is famously opaque and confusing. But the secret is that when you stop jumping to the demands of the body and the mind, you can suddenly realize that nothing is missing. Right there, sitting on your cushion, on your chair in the meditation hall, even as your leg aches and your tummy growls and your mind chatters on about some random thing, you can suddenly see that nothing is missing. You can experience a total lack of lack. And that is such a contrast from the way that we normally live our lives that it's a real shock. It's an absolute and abiding peace, a conviction from the center of your heart that absolutely nothing needs to change. It is the non-dual perfection of the world, which we can experience even as beings in duality. And the miracle of that is a revelation. This is what Zen doesn't tell you, that if we could just put everything down, and if we can take the time and space to see beyond ourselves, we become aware of some great vastness, some deep and abiding sense of interconnection, some sense of complete union. The little self that thinks of itself as Raka can come to rest in the vastness that is all things. And of course, as Vedantists, you know that the vast is literally a translation of Brahman, or what we understand to be the absolute reality, the non-dual divine. But Buddhism doesn't like to talk about that either, of course. The Buddha was famously silent on the topic of God. So why all the silence? If there's this inexpressible peace and joy to be found in our own hearts, freely available at all times, why not proclaim that to the world? For exactly that reason, that it is inexpressible. There is something about all of this in non-dual traditions like Zen and Vedanta that is utterly inexpressible. It's like the wonderful story that Sri Ramakrishna tells, which I'm going to read here in an excerpt from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. A man had 2 sons. The father sent them to a preceptor to learn the knowledge of Brahman. After a few years, they returned from their preceptor's house and bowed low before their father. Wanting to measure the depth of their knowledge of Brahman, he first questioned the older of the 2 boys. "My child," he said, "you have studied all the scriptures. Now tell me, what is the nature of Brahman?" The boy began to explain Brahman by reciting various texts from the Vedas. The father did not say anything. Then he asked the younger son the same question. But the boy remained silent and stood with his eyes cast down. No word escaped his lips. The father was pleased and said to him, "My child, you have understood a little of Brahman. What it is cannot be expressed in words." Sri Ramakrishna goes on to say in the Gospel, "Men often think they have understood Brahman fully. Once an ant went to a hill of sugar. One grain filled its stomach. Taking another grain in its mouth, it started homeward. On its way, it thought, 'Next time I shall carry home the whole hill.' That is the way shallow minds think. They don't know that Brahman is beyond one's words and thought. However great a man may be, how much can he know of Brahman? Sukadeva and sages like him may have been big ants, but even they could carry, at the utmost, 8 or 10 grains of sugar." So Zen takes the meaning of this parable very seriously. Some might say too seriously. Recognizing that the non-dual truth at the heart of the world, what we Vedantists call Brahman, recognizing that that truth is utterly inexpressible by language, and in fact utterly incomprehensible by the mind, Zen doesn't try to do things by halves. It doesn't say, well, yes, it's inexpressible through words, but here are a bunch of words to try to describe it, but don't forget it's indescribable. Most religions try to express the truth somehow or another. Oh, God is good, God is most beautiful and compassionate, etc., etc. But anything that you say about God is inherently false. The moment you open your mouth, you're already wrong, just like that younger son in the parable knew. That's why in Zen practice, you're often told to just shut up and sit. But what are we trying to do? Shh, just sit. But what's the point of all this? Shh, just sit. So when it comes to the principles and practices of Zen, the practice of Zen is exactly that, practice. Just sit. Don't waste your time bouncing around, doing a whole bunch of spiritual seeming things that are adjacent to practice. Just practice. There are lots of ways to enjoy a spiritual vibe without actually doing anything. But there's really no way of sitting without sitting. Going back to what I said at the beginning, Zen practice is unpleasant. It requires real effort. But that effort is paid off by the greatest of all possible rewards, realizing that nothing is missing and being able to live from that knowledge every moment of your life. So that's all the practice. So then what about the principles? I promised you principles. Well, I've already talked about one of the principles, which is at the heart of the non-dual experience of Zazen, emptiness. And we've touched on silence, not speaking of that non-dual reality, which cannot be captured in language or even by the mind. But is there nothing more? Does Zen really offer no scaffolding, no help to break through to that non-dual experience of enlightenment? The answer is not really. If all religions are different paths up to the top of the mountain, Zen is like a sheer jump straight up a cliff face. But in our remaining time together, I want to touch on a few other principles: simplicity, spontaneity, and paradox. So, simplicity. One of the most beautiful things about Zen, to me, is the way that practicing it includes everything. In Zen, your life is your practice. Although sitting meditation, Zazen, as I said, is the beginning, middle, and end of Zen practice, it doesn't start when you sit down on the cushion, and it doesn't end when you get up. That might sound a bit paradoxical. I'm getting ahead of myself. But the true aim of Zazen is to practice a way of being that you can carry with you throughout your day. It's not this abrupt dichotomy Now I'm sitting and doing spirituality, and now I'm going about my day, and those two things are totally separate. No, they're one and the same. It's all one life, right? The same gentle, attentive, kind awareness that you bring to observing your mind when you're sitting on the cushion. It's that same awareness that you walk through your day with, as you're brushing your teeth, as you're commuting to work, as you're joking with your friends, as you're tipping the barista, as you're washing the dishes, as you're falling asleep. In Zen, there isn't the strict demarcation. Oh, well, I go to church on Sundays and the rest of the week I do whatever. Our life is our practice. There's a Zen koan. Koans are kind of like parables from the Book of Serenity. And the koan takes place at a monastery run by a monk named Joshu. The koan goes like this. A monk told Joshu, "I have just entered the monastery. Please teach me." Joshu asked, "Have you eaten your breakfast?" The monk replied, "I have." Joshu said, "Then you had better wash your bowl." At that moment, the monk was enlightened. A lot of these koans end like that. Something happens and then the monk is enlightened. There's one where a monk hears the sound of a pebble striking a tree and becomes enlightened. My partner and I went out and tried throwing pebbles against a tree after we heard that one, but no luck. But I love that koan about having your breakfast and washing your bowl, because Zen is just like that. It's nothing special. What's being said there is, don't fall into the trap of thinking that enlightenment is some fancy, amazing thing with fireworks and disco lights. Enlightenment is just this life. You have your breakfast and you wash your bowl. You do what needs to be done. As is written in the Isha Upanishad, thus working may you live 100 years. Thus alone will you work in real freedom. But it's also obviously not just this life in the way that we experience it. Breakfast, bowls. Oh God, I ate too much for breakfast again. Ugh, now I have to do the dishes. It's this life, but transformed. As Sri Ramakrishna puts it, this very world can become a mansion of mirth, a mart of joy. And so Zen doesn't ask us to turn away from the world, to reject it as a terrible thing to be avoided. Zen asks us to incorporate our practice into every moment of our lives, from washing our face in the morning, to eating breakfast and washing the dishes, to taking care of our daily tasks, and just generally doing what needs to be done. And in doing so, the simple, the banal, the everyday nature of our lives is transformed into the sacred. This is what I mean by the principle of simplicity. Enlightenment is just this very life. That's why if you ever do a retreat at a Zen center, you'll spend some part of each day taking care of the monastery, sweeping the floors, cleaning the windows, scrubbing the toilets, peeling the potatoes. We're asked to embrace the simplicity of whatever task we find ourselves doing. And if we can maintain the gentle, kind, attentive awareness of Zazen throughout our day, we gradually see that there are no nouns, only verbs. The sense of Raka as a separate thing over here and potatoes as a separate thing over there somehow fades away. And all there is in this moment is peeling, sweeping, scrubbing. Things are constantly changing in this relative world. And if we flow with that change and accept whatever we find in this moment without resistance, that is true renunciation. We let go of our fixed ideas of how the world should be, and we surrender to how this moment is, and this moment, and this moment. And gradually, we start to see that we are always here in this eternal present moment. When ideas of ourselves as fixed beings start to dissolve, there is just the universe in all its complexity, just happening. So that's simplicity. There's also a principle of spontaneity in Zen. In the story I mentioned before about the monk who awakened when the pebble struck the tree, that's an example of spontaneity. Awakening isn't like following a recipe step by step. There's mystery and grace involved. It's not like climbing the career ladder or getting a degree. And so Zen abhors repetition, even violently. There's a saying, if you meet the Buddha on the street, kill him. The ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, is something that we have to experience for ourselves. It's not something we can realize through imitation or rote repetition. When you think about it, all of the incarnations or great sages from all the world's religions were iconoclasts. They charted their own path. Ritual can become ritualism through repetition, which is deadening to the spirit. There's a story about a monk who was in charge of doing the evening worship for the deity. And every evening, a cat would come and drink the milk that was being offered. So the monk began to tie up the cat before the worship so that the offering would not be disturbed. One day, he happened to be away during the time of the worship, and when he came back, he found that all the other monks were all flustered and the worship had not yet begun. He asked one of them what was going on, and they said, well, we can't find the cat. So even when we do a ritual that we've done 100 or 1,000 times, we have to remember the principle of spontaneity, of calling forth something genuine from the heart, some true expression of the present moment, spontaneously arising. Otherwise, the rituals will become meaningless, and we'll be tying up cats without knowing why, rather than opening our hearts to the divine. There's so much more to Zen that I can present in 45 minutes, so I'll end this talk with one last principle, paradox. As I've talked about, the non-dual is beyond language, beyond ideas, beyond conceptual thought itself. But we humans love to think. Thinking lets us turn the world into something manageable, rather than me seeing an undifferentiated sea of colors and textures. I can label things and turn them into things that I understand. Oh, that's a chair, that's a table, that's a person, that's another person. So we don't have to confront the terrifying uncertainty and overwhelming nature of this world, which is so far beyond our ability to comprehend. We can just put a little box of conceptual thought around something and then think, oh yes, I know what that is. Oh yes, I know who that person is. And we do that so often and without even questioning it, that in the end, all we see is our own boxes and not the world around us. We do this with everyone. Oh yes, this is my friend who is like this and behaves like that. And over time, we don't even realize that we're not really seeing the person anymore, but just our image of them, the little simulacrum of them that exists in our mind. And so great is our hubris, we even do this with God. Oh yes, God is good, and God will make sure that I don't get sick and that I get that promotion. Like, what? Like Sri Ramakrishna said, we get 1 grain of sugar that fills our stomach, and then we think, next time I'll carry home the whole hill. However great a man may be, how much can he know of Brahman? So Zen tries to break this attachment to a conceptual thought. In fact, everything I've spoken about are different ways to break through that attachment to conceptual thought into emptiness through silence, through simplicity, through spontaneity, and through paradox. There are all sorts of Zen koans that try to do this. You've probably heard the one, what is the sound of one hand clapping? but there are so many. What was your original face before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? And so on. Those are all examples of paradoxes, sure. But I think that the fundamental paradox is what we experience in this very life. Enlightenment, on the one hand, is not something that you can achieve, and yet we have to put in effort to attain it. In the 4 Bodhisattva vows that most Zen centers recite every day, we vow to save all beings, even though that's clearly impossible. This life, as we experience it, brings us suffering, illness, old age, and death. And yet this same life is a mansion of mirth, a mart of joy. God, non-dual reality, cannot be captured in words, and yet it can be experienced and known. In fact, it is what we are experiencing right now without knowing it. That is the real paradox. How to make sense of any of this? You can't. That's the point. Just shut up and sit. So I'm out of time, but I want to end with one of my favorite stories from Master Dogen Zenji. This is the story. One day, Dogen said, "While I was reading the recorded sayings of an ancient master in a monastery in China, a monk from Shu who was practicing the way said, 'What's the use of reading such a book?' I said, 'I want to study the deeds of ancient masters.' He said, 'What's the use of that?' I said, 'I hope to guide people when I go home.' He said, 'What's the use of that?' I said, 'To benefit beings.' He said, 'Ultimately, what's the use of that?' Later, I thought about the meaning of his questions. I realized that reading recorded sayings and koans, studying the deeds of ancient masters, and explaining them to the deluded are of no use for one's own development or in helping others. If you practice just sitting and clarify the great matter, the essential meaning, your understanding becomes unlimited in guiding others, even if you don't know a single letter. That is why the monk said, 'Ultimately, what's the use of that?' Realizing he was right to the point, I stopped reading recorded sayings and other texts. I sat wholeheartedly and clarified the great matter." So my wish for us today is exactly that. May we all sit wholeheartedly and clarify the great matter. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ram Krishna Paramastu. Om peace, peace, peace to all beings.
Raka will take questions, of course. Thank you for the wonderful exposition on the principles and practices of Zen Buddhism. You know, the heart of Zen Buddhism is not put in so many words, but it's a doctrine of dependent origination that the Buddha said, Pratitya Samutpadde. Everything depends on everything else. It's a long chain of cause and effect over and it's so pervasive, it engulfs everything. Everything is dependent. So just sit down and watch. So this sitting down and watching is, as you know, it is called asana. And then watch your breath, it's pranayama, and then you sit down and try to concentrate, keep your mind in the present. That is called pratyahara. So these are all concepts. Concentrate, it's a dhyana, dharana, dhyana, etc. You know, Swami Vivekananda in one place says, Vedanta's yoga perception is Buddhism. I'm sure you have read, yes. So Vedanta has been so kind of like a mother to everything, to every philosophy, every thought, every word, philosophical thought and word, that it has kind of birthed these kind of great teachings. Buddhism, as Raka says, it's just practice. Sit down and practice. Keep quiet. Ultimately, this whole world is a paradox. Then you'll find sitting also is a paradox. So if when you can break the paradox, that is called zazen, that insight. And as she has mentioned, that it comes at the kind of a fullness. Nothing is missing. Thank you once again for this wonderful talk. And the questions haven't come in, but before the questions come in, I would request you to put some questions for clarifications. And later, she will sit down there in the library and take additional questions.
Thank you, Maharaj. Any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering what drew you into Zen Buddhism, and did it turn out to be what you thought it was? And the second question is, how do you reconcile what you're talking about with Zen Buddhism and doing activist work in the world and what we see and believe in? So it does require taking a side and what your beliefs are.
Great questions. Thank you. What drew me, so I really didn't know anything about Zen, and I actually jumped in with a 5-day meditation retreat, so I really got more than I bargained for. But for a long time, I had been wanting some kind of structured meditation space to just really sit and go deep. So that I had been wanting to find some kind of retreat or some place where I could, just sit, but in a structured way where there are other people sitting and there's, a whole process. And so my partner actually ended up, he was going to a Zen retreat, and I just tagged along, and I was hooked. Yeah. And it did it. So I guess I didn't really have any expectations for it. So it wasn't what I thought it would be, though, just in the sense of I didn't anticipate the power of just sitting in a silent retreat for several days. And it really transformed my life, that first retreat. So highly recommend. Yeah. And then the other question also on activism. This is kind of a concern that some people have with Buddhism, that it can feel like quietist. Like you're just sitting there on the cushion, you're not really, what about the world is burning? And my feeling is that when you can come to the world from that place of non-separation, you're actually able to do so much more good in the world just in your very presence. And it also doesn't mean it means do what it needs to be done. So if your role is to, be an activist or to, make some changes in the world, it's not saying don't do that. It's do that compassionate action will arise spontaneously from this space of non-separation that comes from meditation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, from the deeper sense, Buddhism was a reforming religion. It reformed, cultured. But at the same time, when you see that everything is subject to change, and you see the whole sequence of changes, then you become less of a fanatical activist than that breaking down. We want to break down. So these kind of positive activists, they build up. That's the difference between Buddhism, a Buddhistic activist and a non-Buddhistic activist.
Yes.
Any contradictions between the principles and practices of Zen Buddhism versus Vedanta?
I'm more of a joiner and not a divider, so I'm always interested in what the similarities are. And so in my experience, I feel like they complement each other perfectly. It's just the approaches are very different in some ways. I mean, one, that Buddhism is silent on God, and Vedanta is obviously not. So that's would seem to be a contradiction. But in my understanding, when you see that if shunyam is actually purnam, is emptiness that the Buddhism talks about, is that fullness that Vedanta talks about, they're just different ways of expressing the inexpressible nature of Brahman. So, I would say aside from that difference, which I think isn't really a difference, just in the aesthetic and the practices of it, as I said, Zen is very austere and rigorous, and it's just sitting. So different people are drawn to different types of religious practice. So they appear quite different in some ways. Yeah. Any other?
Yeah. You check if there's any online question.
Oh yeah. No, nothing
Not
from
yet.
nothing from the chat. Yeah. So.
Okay, then.
Okay.
She'll be here sitting in the library to take some more questions. Okay, you can see your peace chant again.
Okay. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu. Om peace, peace, peace to all beings.